Okay, welcome to the lecture for research methods. We'll be talking about the first part of Chapter 3 of the APA manual. And in Chapter 3 is where you'll really find the bulk of the advice from the manual on how to write. Where Chapter 4, as we'll see later, gets into more detailed stuff. For example, when to use a hyphen. But this chapter is more kind of big picture writing style. And we'll be talking about the first few sections from about 3.01 to about 3.11. So the first thing we'll talk about is organization within a paper, and generally this is applying to writing a research paper. In terms of the length, how long should it be? Well, long enough is a general rule. Typically, whenever you write something for a research article that's a completed study and you're writing up the results and everything, it's about 30 pages or less. And then you may have to condense it more after you submit it, just because there's a real premium on space in the journal, so you have to say things pretty succinctly. If you're writing a thesis or dissertation, however, those papers often exceed 100 pages, just because they're much more detailed, and the committee that you're basically working for wants to see everything that you're thinking down on paper. As we'll see in a minute, there's really an emphasis on, in general, in scientific writing, to use the minimum amount of words that you need to convey your idea. Okay, so organizing your paper, I encourage you to think about using headings. Obviously, there's some headings that you have to use to kind of be consistent with APA style in terms of methods, heading for the methods, heading for results, heading for discussion. But within those larger sections, it can sometimes be helpful to break things up with headings to help the reader find information they may be looking for. For example, if you're introduction, if you're writing, you might have an opening paragraph and it has no heading, it's kind of general information. But then, you're talking about, PTSD, and you're reviewing the literature, and you want to talk about kind of early stuff and then more recent stuff. So you may have a subheading that's, early conceptualizations of trauma, and then you talk about that for a while. And then you set up a transition to the next section, which will have a heading, current conceptualizations of trauma. And if you're going to do that, use kind of subheadings. Be sure that there are at least two subsections at the same level. Just like when you're doing an outline, for Roman numeral 1, if you're going to have an A, 1A, you need to have a 1B as well, at least two at the same level. In terms of what the headings should look like, table 3.1 does a good job of kind of telling you the style, how each heading should be formatted. But sometimes people aren't sure what things occur at levels 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. So here are some examples. Level 1 headings, things like your method section, your results section, discussion section. So the word method will be, level 1, that centered, uppercase letters, boldface. That's a level 1 heading. And then any subheadings within the method would then go to level 2. And then subheadings within level 2 headings are 3, and so on and so forth. So, for example, level 2 headings within the method section might be design, sample, materials, and procedures. And like I said before, you might have some subheadings within the introduction as well, or maybe even the results section. That's not uncommon. In terms of level 3, if we kind of stay with the method here, so within the method, if I then look at the materials subsection at level 2, within the materials subsection, I might have further subdivided things if I'm looking at different types of measures. So I have multiple measures. So I might have within materials measures of customer satisfaction, and then talk about all the different measures of customer satisfaction I use in my paper. And then measures of employee satisfaction, and then have all the measures, how I measured employee satisfaction in the study. And there are other levels. Typically, for most people, you won't go beyond level 3. But if you need to, APA kind of directs you how to do that. One thing to note here, just for kind of future reference, there's no formal heading for the introduction to the paper. The beginning of the paper, after your abstract, when your intro starts, you don't have the word introduction at the top as a level 1 heading. You simply have the title of your paper centered and not bold, so it's not like a level 1 heading, which is a little inconsistent, but that's APA for you. So just remember not to put in the word introduction at the beginning of the paper, and don't treat that title as a level 1 heading. Okay. Other things with organization, seriation. This is just whenever you are going to have lists of things, more than 2 things, and you're going to separate these things or identify the different pieces of the list of the series with either bullets, numbers, or letters. And let's look now at when you'll do which one of those. Okay. So if your series, if the things that you have a list of are complete sentences, you can choose to use numbers, Arabic numerals, or bullets. An example here would be participants were asked to identify which of the following statements best describe the training style. And then I've got 1, 2, and 3. So I've got these Arabic numerals. There's no parentheses around the numerals. Since these are complete sentences in the list, I punctuate them as complete sentences. So the first letter of the first word in the sentence is capitalized. There's end punctuation at the end of it. You know, if it's a period or a question mark, whatever it is, it's not a semicolon or a comma, because it's a complete sentence. And I could have, instead of using those numerals, I could have done bullets as well. Just depends on what meaning you're trying to convey, and if you're worried about people thinking that things are rank ordered or not. If you're worried about the indication of rank order and you don't intend for things to appear that 1 is better than 2, then use bullets. If your series is comprised of clauses or phrases, you're going to separate these either with commas or semicolons. And it'll depend on if any one of the phrases has an internal comma. So if any one of the phrases within the series, if that phrase has a comma in it, then you separate the phrases by semicolons. Otherwise, you separate them by commas. So within a sentence, you're going to separate the things, again, either with a comma or semicolon, and you can do within a sentence with lowercase letters, or you can do it with bullets. We'll look at both. So here we go. The first one, the three options were A, eat 1 cookie, B, drink 2 sodas, and C, run 3 kilometers, period. So again, in that example, I've got in the sentence, and if you look at each of the phrases, eat 1 cookie, drink 2 sodas, none of the phrases has an internal comma. So each phrase is separated by a comma. In the second example, I kind of changed 2 things here. One, did it with bullets instead of within the sentence. And 2, each of the phrases, and it all takes as one, but each of the phrases actually has internal commas. So, one of the phrases is eat 1 cookie, 1 banana, and 1 pizza. And since there are, commas within that phrase, all the phrases must be separated by semicolons. Excuse me. So you notice you still kind of punctuate it as you would if it were all one sentence. So there's phrase, semicolon, and your conjunction, and then the last phrase, and a period. Okay, so pretty straightforward there. The thing that people just usually forget about is that if you have multiple phrases together with an internal comma, you have to separate them with a semicolon. But not a real tricky deal there, I don't think. Okay, in terms of style of writing, a couple things we'll talk about. The first being continuity, in terms of continuity and presentation of your ideas. Your paper should flow logically. You're taking the reader down a path. You have some point to it that you're trying to make. When you introduce some problem or question, and then you are going to present arguments in a logical order for why your answer is the correct one. So I'll give an example here of first something that's not quite logical. So, though all of the other DSM-4 criteria were equally as likely to be reported regardless of gender, it was evident from the study that 2 assessments that the two assessments needed to be analyzed further to discover why there were significant gender differences with the ICD-10 DCR. So it's a good attempt here to use some kind of traditional phrases to connect ideas. You have the though, comma, and this other thing, but the second idea should follow the first one logically, right? So it's like, although this, so the other thing should contradict it, but the second phrase doesn't follow logically from the first phrase, so there isn't a logical progression of ideas there. If we look at this attempt at a correction here, we have men and women's reports of PTSD symptoms were similar when using the DSM-4 criteria for comparison, but there were some differences between these two groups when using ICD-10 criteria. Okay, so that's the comparison there that we're trying to get. Using one set of criteria, we had one thing, and using another set of criteria, we had another thing. In the previous statement, it tried to get both of that idea across and the idea that we need to look at it further to discover why there are differences. And really, that first sentence was just trying to do too much. There were basically three ideas in that one sentence, and it would be better to break it up into two sentences. So we have this sentence and then probably another sentence following this one that doesn't say because of this it needs to be analyzed, but just say, you know, this difference needs to be analyzed, or one avenue of research would be to explore why this difference exists. So just because there is a difference doesn't mean you have to look at the difference. That's not necessarily logical. Okay. Continuing on with style and continuity, it's important to try to use punctuation to support your meaning. And this means using varied punctuation, commas, semicolons, occasionally dashes, and mixing it up, not relying on one kind of way of punctuating all your sentences, to try to keep the reader moving and don't trip the reader up with kind of confusing punctuation. An example here would be the stimuli were designed to elicit fear responses, period. However, participants did not exhibit signs of fear while viewing the stimuli. So that's fine. That's well punctuated, right? So here's a sentence, period, however, comma, something that is contradictory to the first sentence. So these ideas are logically related, and the word however tells you how to relate them logically, and it's correctly punctuated. Sometimes I'll say it punctuated like this, same sentence, but instead we have the stimuli were designed to elicit fear responses. However, participants did not exhibit signs of fear or anxiety while viewing the stimuli. And here, treating however sort of like the word but as a conjunction, but still like the word however because there's a comma after it, and it can be confusing for readers what's intended. So make sure you're punctuating correctly, otherwise readers will stumble over your words and it'll break up the continuity of the paper. Now really the big one for me is the use of transitional words or phrases. The movement of ideas should be guided with these phrases. Right? So, does the transition between ideas indicate that one logically follows the previous one? If so, you might use phrases like therefore or consequently. Or, maybe when you go from one idea to the other, one idea runs counter to the other. And then you're going to use a phrase like however or conversely. And the important thing is just to make sure you use these phrases appropriately. The other thing is try not to overuse a particular phrase. And what happens, it seems, is people have their pet phrases. Some people like that therefore, some people like consequently, and then they'll use that same phrase over and over and over again, and it gets kind of annoying to the reader. So use the phrases, but mix them up, and of course make sure you're using them appropriately. The last thing about continuity, I think one of the best strategies you can employ to make sure that you have good continuity is to, because continuity is all about having this kind of logical framework. And the best way to get a logical framework is not to try to just go through and write paragraphs, but it's to write an outline. Right? An outline that's solid, where you have ideas that in their simplest form, so you can see how one leads to the next, and then build around that outline. Build your paper, your introduction especially, around that outline. I think you'll find much easier to have ideas flow and not just kind of a smattering of, okay, here's an idea, and then, oh, here's another idea, ooh, here's another idea, just kind of shotgunned, but more logical and connected. Okay. More stuff in terms of style, smoothness of expression, related to continuity. And continuity of ideas is necessary, but not sufficient for smoothness of expression. If you have these abrupt moves from one idea to another, it's not going to be smoothly expressed. But even if you have one idea that logically leads to the next, if you don't write it well and it doesn't sound good, you won't have smoothness of expression. So this is a lot about how it sounds. Because when people read stuff, they're basically talking to themselves and they're hearing your paper. So one good way to figure out if it sounds good is to read your paper aloud. And my advice would be to read it as if you're giving a speech. Right? So imagine this audience of students in your research methods class, and read your paper and see how it flows. And even better, have someone listen to you read it if you have a willing soul who will do that for you, and have them point out to you whenever they kind of feel lost or misunderstand something, or seems like there's a jump somewhere. And that'll help you avoid abrupt shifts, which is one of the things you want to do to have smooth expression. And this is both abrupt shifts in ideas, which relates to continuity, and also abrupt shifts in style. And this is often about tense. So using the appropriate tense in the appropriate section, but not jumping back and forth between past and present in a way that can be kind of jarring to the reader. Another thing I put in here, check your blind spot. And this is just to kind of remind me to talk about when we write, typically what happens is we fill in any kind of logical gaps in our own head. But sometimes we forget to get these kind of fillings down on paper. It's hard to see them yourself. It's kind of a blind spot. You know what you meant, and you know what the connection is. And so when you read your own paper, you don't see that there's something missing. Well, of course A leads to B, because blah, blah, blah. You didn't write the blah, blah, blah part. So often it's important to get someone else to read your paper and let you know if they don't get it, if there's something missing. And that's, if they're just giving you some feedback, okay, this doesn't make sense, that's not collusion, that's not, in my class, it's not a violation of academic integrity. If they rewrite it for you, now we're getting towards something that you don't want to do. But yeah, people can read your stuff and give you advice, and that's perfectly acceptable and appropriate. In terms of the tone of your paper, it should be professional, but not too dry. Although my recommendation to people who are still getting comfortable writing professionally is to err on the side of being dry than to err on the side of being unprofessional. Some of the really good writers in the field can get away with more kind of flowery language or kind of comical things in their writing. But if you do it poorly, it looks really bad. So I encourage people who are just getting comfortable, make it a little drier if that feels safer. But in terms of being professional in tone, some examples of things. One thing not to do would be say, this approach was completely useless for helping kids with nightmares. That's fine for talking with people, about something, but it doesn't have a professional tone. A more professional way to say that would be, this approach did not have a significant effect on nightmares. And it's also more precise than saying something is completely useless. So one thing that may help you deciding if a tone is appropriate or not is to imagine your audience, and imagine an educated audience. So it's an audience who, think about kind of college educated, but not necessarily an expert in the same field as yourself, because again, you don't want to be using, as we'll talk later, kind of these jargon words or phrases that only people who've been reading everything you read would know what you're talking about. But your vocabulary level and your tone should be at a level where a kind of educated person can understand it and appreciate it. and that will hopefully help you get a feel for the appropriate tone. More stuff in terms of style, economy of expression. This is also referred to as parsimony expression. Right? This is all about trying to say stuff as quickly, as briefly as possible. And this is an important part of writing, but I encourage you, when you're writing a first draft, don't worry too much about economy of expression. Right? It's okay to have some kind of verbal diarrhea on the first draft. And then when you go back to the next draft, start to tighten it up and make things more concise. If you try to be too concise at the beginning, sometimes that'll lead to kind of writer's block. Oh, I got to say it the exact right way. My advice is just go ahead and put it all out there, put it all on the paper, and then sort through and kind of cull out the things that you need and the things you don't need. Okay, some things about economy of expression: wordiness. This is just, obviously, if something can be said with fewer words, do so. Here's an example of something pretty wordy. Looking further into the study that was conducted by Soros and Klein, it is possible to notice some of the differences between men and women regarding the choices they make of how they prefer to spend their time when relaxing or having fun. If you have any sentence like this where you're out of breath after reading it, it's probably too long and probably pretty wordy. Now, the basic idea here is that men and women differ in terms of how they like to spend their time, right? And that's based on something that Soros and Klein said. So we can say it much more briefly: men and women differ in how they choose to spend their leisure time. Soros and Klein, 2003. So again, if you write that first sentence in your first draft, that's fine. Get it out, but you need to be able to pull it down, tighten it up into shorter sentences, typically. Another thing that I see a lot is when people say things like Smith et al. Conducted a study and found blah blah. Unless you're going to talk about something unique about how they conducted the study, like they conducted the first study to examine the use of virtual technology in the treatment of phobias. Okay, then talk about the study. Otherwise, just say, Smith et al. Found blah blah blah, because the reader is going to, the educated reader will know if you're saying that so and so found something. They didn't find it on the side of the road. They found it as a result of conducting a study. Again, so you only talk about conducting a study if you're going to talk about some key aspect of the study or something that's important about their methodology, perhaps. Otherwise, you can cut those words out. More stuff on economy of expression. Redundancy. Seems obvious, but people still do it. And it can occur different ways. Sometimes same word repeated, those kind of the obvious ones. Other times, same idea that gets unnecessarily repeated. So here we have the increased rate in suicides among male African American adolescents has been steadily increasing. So again, we're saying the increased rate has been increasing, and that is redundant. Probably best correction here would be to take out the first increase. So the rate, of suicides has been increasing. Another one. Notably, higher internalized elevated behavioral problems are being reported by the parents. And sometimes when we have these kind of long adjective strings, it's important to look at what they're modifying. So we have, in this sentence, blah, 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 problems. So what kind of problems? Behavioral problems. What kind of behavioral problems? Internalized one. Internalized behavioral problems. And they're higher internalized behavioral problems, and they're also elevated internalized behavioral problems. And higher and elevated are two different ways of saying the same thing, so there's obviously some redundancy there. Here's another one that is probably a little less obvious. Culturally, heterosexuality is the predominant norm. Again, not using the same words here, but if something is a norm, it is by definition predominant, unless you're going to kind of clarify that it's some sort of subcultural norm. But generally, a norm, something that's normative, is by definition predominant, so you don't need the word predominant. Okay. Unit length. So I talked before about short sentences. So sentences and paragraphs shouldn't be overly long, but you don't want just a bunch of short, choppy sentences either. You want a nice mix of short and long sentences. And if you have two sentences that are logically related and they're both short, connect them with a conjunction or a semicolon. and to make a longer sentence, and that's easier to read and it flows better. But don't force kind of these jumbo sentences where you have three independent clauses joined by semicolons. In terms of how long is too long, well, if you have a paragraph that's over a page long, it should probably be divided into subparagraphs. And one good thing to go by here is, a paragraph should have one main idea. When you go from one main idea to another idea, that should be a new paragraph. In terms of how short can it be, well, a paragraph needs to be at least 3 sentences to justify it existing. And if you have a main idea, hopefully you have at least 3 things to say about the idea in terms of supporting the idea. Now we get into precision and clarity, and this is I think probably one of the biggest ones. This is all about writing exactly what you mean so that it couldn't possibly be misinterpreted. So here's where you almost imagine your audience not so educated. Okay, so if some doofus is reading my paper, would they still understand what I meant whenever I wrote this, or could they, oh, did you mean this or this? Is it clear? So you kind of have to go back and forth between writing for an educated audience, but also making sure that even the doofuses in your audience know what you're saying. One thing to watch out for is word choice. Sometimes whenever people are trying to avoid quoting a source, or they're trying to paraphrase, they change words, and the word they change to doesn't mean exactly, they have exactly the meaning they wanted it to have, or that the original word had. So you have to kind of be careful of that. And if I'm commenting on your paper, I'll put WC, usually by a word, if I'm wondering about your word choice. An example here, as detailed as the diagnosis may appear, poor inter-rater reliability continues to be a problem. And that seems kind of okay at first glance, but we have to break it down. Okay, this word diagnosis. So you're saying the diagnosis is detailed, and a diagnosis is you have this or you have this. It's a categorical decision, and a category isn't really detailed or lacking in detail. What they meant to say probably was as detailed as the diagnostic criteria may appear. So these criteria may be detailed or lacking in detail, may be vague. But the diagnosis itself, not. So that's kind of a tricky one in terms of making sure you're using the right word choice. Another one that I jump on people for a lot, colloquial expressions, and this is just using familiar language. It's like, a lot of people think, that's familiar language. Again, doesn't go with the tone of our paper. Another example here, blah, 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 soldiers were given diaries so they could jot down their feelings. Jot down, it's fine for talking to your friends, but that's kind of familiar, common language that doesn't fit in a professional piece of writing. So, instead of, so they could jot down, so they could write down, or so they could record, whatever. Another one, jargon. You don't want to use overly technical language. And this often happens when really you're trying too hard to sound fancy or smart. Something to watch out for, just because you get so used to jargon that you're used to, you think everybody else knows it, especially military jargon and acronyms. It becomes such a part of your vocabulary that it's hard to remember that people don't know what you're talking about. Here's an example of kind of a jargony, wordy sentence. Inculcation of a regimented respiratory exercise is associated with decrements in physiological markers of neurotic phenomena. Sounds fancy, right? It's a little bit too fancy. It'd be much simpler to say learning breathing techniques is associated with decreases in physical symptoms of anxiety. So we don't want to use kind of too plain of language, going to kind of colloquialisms. We also don't want to use too jargony or too professional a language where only somebody working exactly in the same field you're working would understand what you're talking about. So it's a balance. More stuff on precision and clarity. When using pronouns, make sure that what noun the pronoun is referring to is clear. Make sure there's a clear referent. There's not any kind of confusion about who the they or the he or the she is that you're talking about. Also make sure that the pronoun and the referent agree in number and in gender. An example here, so if Jones et al. 2005 reported blah blah blah, and the next sentence is he also reported. Well, we've got two problems here. One, Jones et al. Isn't a he; it's a they, right? So the pronoun and the referent don't agree in number. And then let's take away for a minute the et al. Assume that it was Jones 2005. You want to make sure that Jones is a he if you're going to use the masculine pronoun. So go look at the first name and try to figure out. And if you can't, then you're going to have to reword the sentence because you don't. Let's talk later. You don't want to use gender biased language because he isn't gender neutral. He only refers to men. Okay, so pay attention to use of pronouns. Make sure that things match up. And it's clear what you're referring to. Another one that people seem to struggle with sometimes is comparisons. You want your comparisons to be clear and logical. This is when you're saying two things are similar or they're different. Somehow you're comparing two or maybe more things. An example of something that may be unclear. Females respond to danger and distress differently than males. And I know most people go, okay, yeah, I get that. So females and males differ. Cool. But, if you have that doofus in the audience, they may think females respond to danger differently than males. Okay, so when females are responding to danger, that's a different response than when they're responding to males, which isn't what you mean, but it's not clear what you mean. So use as clear language as possible. And two ways to fix this sentence, right? One, females respond to danger and distress differently than males respond to stress. And so what you're doing is you have this parallel construction about females and males, and in the first sentence you didn't complete the parallelism. So here we complete it by tacking on the end of it. So females respond and males respond, and they differ. The other thing to do is to move the both groups that are being compared to the beginning of the sentence. So females respond differently than males to danger and distress. That way it's clear what they're differing on. Okay. Continuing with precision and clarity in terms of attribution, and this is all about verbs in a sentence. Verbs in a sentence. Who's the actor in the sentence? You need to be clear about who that is and make sure it's appropriate. One thing will be the use of third person, and this will be a little different than maybe you've heard before, or even other classes where there are kind of different rules for this. But it is okay to use the third person pronoun, I or we, in an APA paper, and it's appropriate to do so when you're talking about things that you did in the study. Instead, because you don't want to say the experimenters, because then it's not clear. Are you talking about you and your study, or are you talking about some other study? So when you're talking about your study, we examined rather than the experimenters examined. You don't talk about. It's not like you're writing a paper for somebody else. You're writing about your own paper. So talking about things that you did, you can use the we or the I. And it's permissible to use the I or the we when referring to your own ideas. But really, the tendency that you'll see, I think, in most papers is not to do this, but instead to use kind of tentative language to help the reader identify that something is an opinion. And if there's a tentative language and no citation present, the assumption is that it's your opinion. So rather than saying, I think that women are smarter than men, what I think you'll find more often is women may be smarter than men, which that word may in there makes it clear that it's an opinion, and if there's not a citation, then it should be clear that it's the author of the paper's opinion. One that people don't hear about much outside of APA, anthropomorphism, and this is attributing human characteristics or actions to animals or inanimate sources. So some examples, the scales avoided bias by blah blah. So scales can't avoid anything, right? They're not human. They can't take action. Another one you may see, the study challenged the idea, right? And again, the study can't do anything. It's just a study. It's some concept, right? Then it can't even lay on the floor. It's just an idea of something. So instead, you would say something like, the use of scales does not result in biased decisions, which again is a little wordier than the original way, but at least you're avoiding this anthropomorphism. And the results of the study indicated, and here's kind of a weird thing about APA. We kind of allow anthropomorphism when talking about results and using words like indicated or showed, which is a little inconsistent to me, but that that's our tradition. Um, so results can show or indicate something, but a study can't. um, I think most often when anthropomorphism occurs in people's writings is when I'm talking about a study. And when you're talking, if you are talking about, the study challenged the idea, and you really want to talk about, that phrase of challenge the idea, the thing to do is just to substitute the authors for the word the study. Make sure the authors are the subject of the sentence, because the authors can challenge the idea because they are human. Okay. The last thing kind of want to touch on is the use of the editorial we. I said earlier that you can use the we or the I to refer to what you did or thought, but we don't use the we to refer to people. We generally consider people to be self-determining. That's not appropriate for APA style. And all you have to do, instead of using, when you're wanting to use we to refer to people, just use people instead. So people generally consider blah blah blah. Okay, so that's about it for now. I know it's a lot to remember, a lot to think about, and the best thing is to be aware of kind of the main ideas, which in my mind are being concise and precise in your writing. So saying things briefly and saying exactly what you mean. And then obviously after you write, go back and check the rules to see if you're kind of adhering to APA style or not, rather than trying to kind of just laboriously work through it as you're writing every sentence, checking it against the manual. That'll drive you nuts. Okay? Good luck in your writing.